Hey, boys and girls, I'm back. This time I've moved places in my house. I'm sitting in my bed now because my husband is up and in the living room. So I moved from his chair. I'm in my bedroom. And yes, my hair is actually straight and not in a ponytail. Today I was part of the caravan and drove around. I got to see some of you guys. Super awesome. But I'm going to read a few more chapters. I want to finish everything from week 2. So I finished 16 on the last video. So, pending I don't run out of breath, I'm going to try to read 17 to 22. That'll be the rest of the chapters for week 2. So then hopefully you guys can listen to all that. So I'm going to get started. Chapter 17 is In the Course of a Lifetime. In my book, it is page 102. All right, ready? A few days after Phoebe and I had seen Mr. Berkway and Mrs. Cadaver whacking away at the rhododendron, I walked home with Phoebe after school. She was as crotchety and sullen as a 3-legged mule, and I was not quite sure why. She'd been asking me why I had not said anything to my father of Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway, and I told her I was waiting for the right time. Your father was over there yesterday, Phoebe said. I saw him. He'd better watch out. What would you do if Mrs. Cadaver chopped up your father? Would you go live with your mother? It surprised me when she said that, reminding me that I had told Phoebe nothing about my mother. Yes, I suppose I would go live with her. That was impossible, and I knew it. But for some reason, I could not tell Phoebe that. So I lied. Phoebe's mother was sitting at the kitchen table when we walked in. In front of her was a pan of burned brownie. She blew her nose. Oh, sweetie, she said, you startled me. How was it? How was what? Phoebe said. Why, sweetie, school, of course. How was it? How were your classes? Okay. Just okay? Mrs. Winterbottom suddenly leaned over and kissed Phoebe's cheek. I'm not a baby, you know, Phoebe said, wiping off the kiss. Winterbottom stabbed the brownies with a knife. Want one? She asked. They're burnt, Phoebe said. Besides, I'm too fat. Oh, sweetie, you're not fat, Mrs. Winterbottom said. I am. No, you're not. I am. Phoebe shouted at her mother. You don't have to bake things for me. I'm too fat, and you don't have to wait here for me to come home. I'm 13 now. Phoebe marched upstairs. Mrs. Winterbottom offered me a brownie, so I sat down at the table. What I started doing was remembering the day before my mother left. I did not know it would be her last day home. Several times that day, my mother asked me if I wanted to walk up in the field with her. It was drizzling outside, and I was cleaning out my desk, and I just did not feel like going. Maybe later, I kept saying. When she asked me for about the 10th time, I said, No, I don't want to go. Why do you keep asking me? I don't know why I did that. I didn't mean anything by it, but that was one of the last memories she had of me, and I wished I could take it back. Phoebe's sister Prudence stormed into the house, slamming the door behind her. I blew it. I just know it, she wailed. Oh, sweetie, her mother said. I did, Prudence said. I did. Mrs. Winterbottom half heartedly chipped away at the burned brownies and asked Prudence if she would have another chance for cheerleading tryouts. Yes, tomorrow, but I know I'm going to blow it. Her mother said, Maybe I'll come along and watch. I could tell that Mrs. Winterbottom was trying to rise above some awful sadness she was feeling, but Prudence couldn't see that. Prudence had her own agenda, just as I had my own agenda that day my mother wanted to walk with me. I couldn't see my own mother's sadness. What? Prudence said. Come along and watch? Yes, wouldn't that be nice? No, Prudence said. No, you can't. It would be awful. I heard the front door open and shut, and Phoebe came in the kitchen waving a white envelope. Guess what was on the steps, she said. Mrs. Winterbottom took the envelope and turned it over and over before she slowly unsealed it and slipped out the message. Oh, she said, who is doing this? She held out a piece of paper. In the course of a lifetime. What does it matter? Prudence said, Well, I have important things to worry about, I can assure you. I know I'm just going to blow these cheerleading tryouts. I just know it. On and on she went until Phoebe said, Cripes, Prudence, in the course of a lifetime, what does it matter? At that moment, it was as if a switch went off in Mrs. Winterbottom's brain. She put her hand to her mouth and stared out the window. She was invisible to Prudence and Phoebe, though. They did not notice. Prudence said, Are these cheerleading tryouts such a big deal? Will you even remember them in 5 years? Yes. How about 10? Will you remember them in 10? Yes, Prudence said. As I walked home, I thought about the message. In the course of a lifetime, what does it matter? I said it over and over. I wondered about the mysterious messenger, and I wondered about all the things in the course of a lifetime that would not matter. I did not think cheerleading tryouts would matter, but I was not sure about yelling at your mother. I was certain, however, if your mother left, it would be something that mattered in the whole long course of your lifetime. That is the end of chapter 17. And I don't know about you, but I feel like every time we hear about Mrs. Winterbottom, her mood keeps on getting worse and worse and worse. And no one is seeming to notice except for Sal. Dun 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 dun. We are heading on. And there's another message from the mysterious messenger. In a course of a lifetime, what does it matter? I like that. Sometimes I think that we need to think of like the bigger picture, like when something upsets us and we let it ruin our day or something like that. Like, why do we let it ruin something when in a course of a lifetime it's not going to matter? So I really like that message. That might be my favorite message of the mysterious person so far. Um, I'm heading on to chapter 18, The Good Man. I should mention my father. When I was telling Phoebe's story to Graham and Grams, I did not say much about my father. He was their son, and not only did they know him better than I, but Graham often said he was the light of their lives. They had three other sons at one time, but one son died when a tractor flipped over on him, one was killed when he skied into a tree, and the third died when he jumped into the freezing cold Ohio River to save his best friend. The best friend survived, but my uncle did not. My father was the only son left, but even if their other sons were still alive, my father might still be the light because he is also a kind, honest, simple, and good man. I do not mean to simple as a simple minded, I mean he likes plain and simple things. His favorite clothes are flannel shirts and blue jeans that he's had for 20 years, and nearly killed him to buy new white shirts and a suit for his new job in Euclid. He loved the farm because he could be out in the real air and he wouldn't wear work gloves because he liked to touch the earth and the wood and the animals. It was painful for him to go to work in the office when we moved. He did not like being sealed up inside with nothing real to touch. We had the same car, a blue Chevy, for 15 years. He couldn't bear to part with it. He had touched it and repaired it, every inch of it. I also think he couldn't bear the thought that if he sold it, someone might take it to the junkyard. My father hated the whole idea of putting cars out to the pasture. He often prowled through junkyards, touching old cars and buying old alternators and carburetors just for the joy of cleaning them up and making them work again. My grandfather had never quite gotten the hang of car mechanics, and so he thought my father was a genius. My mother was right when she said my father was good. He was always thinking of little things to cheer up someone else. This nearly drove my mother be crazy because I think she wanted to keep up with him, but it was not her natural gift like it was my father's. He would be out in the field and see a flowering bush that my grandmother might like and would dig up the whole thing and take it straight over to Graham's garden and replant it. If it snowed, he would be up at dawn to trek over to his parents' house and shovel out their driveway. If he went into town to buy supplies for the farm, he would come back with something for my mother and something for me. They were small things, a cotton scarf, a book, a glass paperweight, but whatever he brought, it was exactly what you think you would have picked out for yourself. I had never seen him angry. Sometimes I don't think you're human, my mother told him. It was the sort of thing she said just before she left, and it bothered me because it seemed like as if she wanted him to be meaner, less good. 2 days before she left, when I first heard her raise the subject of leaving, she said, I feel so rotten in comparison. Sugar, you're not rotten, he said. See, she said, see, why couldn't you at least believe me? I'm rotten. Because you're not, he said. She said she had to leave in order to clear her head and to clear her heart of all the bad things. She needed to learn about what she was. You can do that here, Sugar, he said. I need to do it on my own, she said. I can't think. All I see here is what I'm not, and I am not brave. I am not good, and I wish someone would call me by my real name. My name isn't Sugar, it's Chanhassen. She had not been well. She had had some terrible shocks, it is true, but I did not understand why she could not get better with us. I begged her to take me with her, but she said I could not miss school and my father needed me, and besides, she had to go alone. She had to. I thought she might change her mind, or at least tell me when she was leaving, but she did neither of those things. She left me a letter which explained that if she said goodbye, it would be too terribly painful, and it would sound too permanent. She wanted me to know that she would think of me every minute, and that she would be back before the tulips bloomed. But of course, she was not back before the tulips bloomed. It nearly killed my father after she left, I know it, but he continued doing everything just as before, whistling and humming and finding little gifts for people. He kept bringing home gifts for my mother and stacking them in a pile in their bedroom. On the day after he found out she wasn't returning, he flew to Lewiston, Idaho, and when he came back, he spent 3 days chipping away at the fireplace hidden behind the plaster wall. Some of the cement grouting between the bricks had to be replaced, and he wrote her name in the cement. He wrote Chanhassen, not Sugar. 3 weeks later, he put the farm up for sale. By this time, was receiving letters from Mrs. Cadaver, and I knew that he was answering her letters. Then we drove up to see Mrs. Cadaver while I strayed with Graham and Grams. When he came back, he said we were moving to Euclid. Mrs. Cadaver had helped him find a job. I didn't even wonder how he met Mrs. Cadaver or how long he had known her. I ignored her whole existence. Besides, I was too busy throwing the most colossal temple tantrums. I refused to move. I would not leave our farm, our maple tree, our swimming hole, our pigs, our chickens, our hayloft. I would not leave the place that belonged to me. I would not leave the place which I had convinced my mother might return. At first, my father did not argue with me. He let me behave like a wild boar. At last, he took down the for sale sign and put up a for rent sign. He said he would rent out the farm, hire someone to care for the animals and the crops, and rent a house for us in Euclid. The farm would still belong to us, and one day we could to return to it. But for now, he said, we have to leave it because your mother is haunting me day and night. She's in the fields, the air, the barn, the walls, the trees. He said we were making this move to learn about bravery and courage. That sounded awfully familiar. In the end, I think I merely ran out of steam. I stopped throwing tantrums. I didn't help pack, but when it came time, I climbed in the car and joined my father for the move to Euclid. I did not feel brave, and I did not feel courageous. When I told my story of Phoebe to Graham and Gramps, I mentioned none of this. They knew it already. They knew my father was a good man. They knew I did not want to leave the farm. They knew my father felt we had to leave. They also knew that my father had tried many times to explain to me about Margaret, but that I wouldn't hear it. On that long day that my father and I left the farm behind and drove to Euclid, I wished that my father was not such a good man, so there would be someone to blame for my mother's leaving. I didn't want to blame her. She was my mother, and she was part of me. So that gave us a little bit more insight into, oh, that's the end of chapter 18. That gave us a little bit more insight into Sal's father. And Sal's father to me sounds like, well, obviously a good man, but super even tempered. Like he never gets upset, he never gets angry. He is just like a kind hearted person. I feel like he's a genuine person. I feel like those are the type of people we don't really find in this world today. So I really liked hearing about him. And Sal, I wish like we knew a little bit more Sal before all this stuff happened, before her mother left, and we don't know why her mom can't return or isn't returning. And I wish we knew like more about Sal like before then. Like I wish there was more information about her and her mother together. Um but it makes me sad anytime whenever Sal talks about her mom leaving, it makes me sad. But we're gonna continue on for Mrs. Kneifel like starts crying. Fish in the Air, chapter 19. We'll see how this one goes. Sorry, I'm getting out of breath from reading so much. Okay. Chapter 19. Graham said, where did you live off with Phoebe? What was happening? What's the matter, Gooseberry? Gramps said. Did that snake bite your brains? No, she said. It did not bite my brains. I was just trying to refresh my memory. Let's see, Gramps said. Didn't Peebe want you to tell your daddy about Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway hacking up her husband? Yes, that is what Phoebe wanted, and it was what I tried to do. One Sunday, when my father was looking through a photo album, I asked if he knew much about Mrs. Cadaver. He looked up quickly. You ready to talk about Margaret? He said. Well, there were a few things I wanted to mention. I've been waiting to explain, he said. I plunged on. I didn't want him to explain. I wanted to warn him. Phoebe and I saw her slashing and hacking away at the bushes in her backyard. Is there something wrong with that? Her father asked. I tried another approach. Her voice is like dead leaves blowing around, and her hair is spooky. I see, he said. And there was this man who visits her. Sal, that sounds a lot like spying. And I don't think we should go over there anymore. Dad took off his glasses and rubbed them on his shirt for about 5 minutes. Then he said, Sal, you're trying to catch fish in the air. Your mother is not coming back. It looked like I was merely jealous of Mrs. Cadaver. There, in the calm light of my father, all those things that Phoebe had said about Mrs. Cadaver seemed foolish. I'd like to explain about her, my father said. Oh, never mind. Just forget I mentioned her. I don't need any explanations. Later, when I was doing my homework, I found myself doodling in the margin of my English book. I had drawn a figure of a woman with wild hair and evil eyes and a rope around her neck. I drew a tree, fastened the rope to it, and hung her. The next day at school, I studied Mr. Berkway as he leaped and caravated about the classroom. If he was a murderer, he certainly was a lively one. I had always pictured murderers as being mopey and sullen. I hoped Mr. Berkway was in love with Mrs. Margaret Cadaver and would marry her and take her away so that my father and I could go back to Bybanks. What I found most surprising about Mr. Berkway was his increasingly reminding me of my mother, or at least of my mother before the sadness set in. There was this liveliness to both Mr. Berkway and my mother, and an excitement, a passion for words and for stories. That day, Mr. Berkway talked about Greek mythology. I started daydreaming about my mother, who loved books almost as much as she loved all her outdoor treasures. She liked to carry little books in her pocket, and sometimes when we were out in the field, she'd flop down in the grass and start reading aloud. My mother especially liked Indian stories. She knew about thunder gods, earth makers, wise crows, sly coyotes, and shadow souls. Her favorite stories were about these people who came back after death as a bird or a river or a horse. She even knew one story about an old warrior who came back as a potato. The next thing I knew, Mr. Berkway was saying, Right, Phoebe? Are you awake? You have the second report? Report? Phoebe said. Mr. Berkway clenched his heart. Ben is doing the oral report on Prometheus this Friday, and you're doing one on Pandora next Monday. Lucky me, Phoebe muttered. Mr. Berkway asked me to stay after class for a minute. Phoebe sent me a warning message with her eyebrows. As everyone else was leaving the room, Phoebe said, I'll stay with you if you want. Why? Because of him hacking on Mr. Cadaver, that's what. I don't think you should be alone with him. He did not hack me up. Instead, he gave me a special assignment, a mini journal. I don't know what this is, I said. Phoebe was breathing on my shoulder. Mr. Berkway said I should write about something that interests me. Like what? I said. Oh, a place, a room, a person. Don't worry about it too much. Just write whatever comes to mind. Phoebe and I walked home with Mary Lou and Ben. My brain was a mess. What with trying not to flinch whenever Bren brushes against me. When we left Ben and Mary Lou and turned the corner onto Phoebe Street, I wasn't paying much attention. I suppose I was aware that someone was coming along the sidewalk in our direction, but it wasn't until the person was about 3 feet away that I really noticed. It was Phoebe's lunatic. Coming towards us, staring right at us, he stopped directly in front of us, blocking our way. Phoebe Winterbottom, right? He said to Phoebe. Her voice was a little squeak. This sound came out as a tiny, What's the matter? He said. He slid one hand into his pocket. Phoebe pushed him, yanked my arm, and started running. Oh my God, she said. Oh my God. I was grateful that we were nearly at Phoebe's house, so if he stabbed us in broad daylight, maybe one of her neighbors would discover our bodies and would take us to the hospital before we bled entirely to death. I was beginning to believe he was a lunatic. Pause there. Phoebe is really getting to Sal, I feel like. And also, do you feel like Ben has a crush on Miss Sal? Because I feel like Ben has a crush on Sal. Phoebe tugged at her doorknob, but the door was locked. Phoebe beat on the door, and her mother suddenly opened it and looked rather pale and shaken herself. It was locked, Phoebe said. Why was the door locked? Oh, sweetie, Mrs. Winterbottom said. It's just that I thought that. She peered around us and looked up and down the street. Did you see someone? Did someone frighten you? It was the lunatic, Phoebe said. We saw him just now. She could hardly catch her breath. Maybe we should call the police or tell Dad. Took a good long look at Phoebe's mother. She did not seem capable of phoning the police or Mr. Winterbottom. I think she was more scared than we were. She went around locking all the doors. Nothing more happened that evening, and by the time I went home, the lunatic did not seem quite so threatening. No one called the police, and to my knowledge, Mrs. Winterbottom had not yet told Mr. Winterbottom. But right before I left Phoebe's house, Phoebe said to me, if I see the lunatic one more time, I'll phone the police myself. Dun 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 dun. Okay, so that's the third time we've seen the lunatic. First time at Phoebe's house, then at this little store thing, and now on the sidewalk. He literally said Phoebe Winterbottom, and then they like took off running, like so scared. So Phoebe is getting to Sal. We are heading on to chapter 20. We are on page 121 of my book, so we are like about halfway through it. So go us. I'm gonna continue on. This is called The Blackberry Kiss. That night, I tried to write the mini journal for Mr. Berkway. First, I made a list of all the things I liked, and they were all things from Bybanks: the trees, the cows, the chickens, the pigs, the fields, the swimming hole. It was a complete jumble of things, and when I tried to write about one of those things, I ended up writing about my mother, because everything was connected to her. At last, I wrote about the blackberry kiss. One morning when I woke up early, I saw my mother walking up the hill to the barn. Mist hung above the ground. Finches were singing in the oak tree beside the house, and there was my mother, her pregnant belly sticking out in front of her, and she was strolling up the hill, swinging her arms and singing, "Oh, don't fall in love with a sailor boy, a sailor boy, a sailor boy. Don't fall in love with a sailor boy, 'cause he'll take your heart to sea." As she approached the corner of the barn, where the sugar maple stands, she plucked a few blackberries from a stray bush and popped them into her mouth. She looked all around her, back at the house, across the fields, and looked into the canopy of the branches overhead. She took several quick steps to the trunk of the maple, threw her arms around it, and kissed that tree soundly. Later that day, I examined this tree trunk. I tried to wrap my arms around it, but the trunk was much bigger than it had seemed from my window. I looked up to where my mother must have touched the trunk. I probably imagined this, but I thought I could detect a small dark stain as from a blackberry kiss. I put my ear against the trunk and listened. I faced the tree squarely and kissed it firmly. To this day, I can smell the smell of the bark, a sweet woody smell, and the feel of the ridges in the bark, and the distinctive taste on my lips. In my mini journal, I confess that I had since kissed all different kinds of trees. Each family of trees, oaks, maples, elms, birches, had a special flavor all its own, mixed in with each tree's own taste, with the slight taste of blackberries, and why this was so I could not explain. The next day, I turned in this story to Mr. Berkway. He didn't read it or even look at it, but he said marvelous, brilliant, as he slipped it into his briefcase. I'll put it with the other journals. Phoebe said, "Did you write about me?" Ben said, "Did you write about me?" Mr. Berkway bounded around the room as if the opportunity to teach us was his notion of paradise. He read a poem by E. E. Cummings titled "The Little Horse" in the new ly. And the reason why the only capital letter in the title was Y at the end of newly is because Mr. Cummings liked to do it that way. He probably never took English, Phoebe said. Ah, joke. To me, that Y looked like a newly born horse standing up on his thin legs. The poem was about a newly born horse who doesn't know anything but feels everything. He lives in a so beautifully fold world. I like that. I'm not sure what it was, but I liked it. Everything sounded soft and safe. That day, Phoebe left school early for a dentist appointment. I started walking home alone, but Ben joined me. I was completely unprepared for what happened on the way home, but for what happened later. And for what happened later. Ben and I were simply walking along, and he said, "Did you ever read your poem?" "No." "I know how to do it," he said. "Want me to read yours?" So, reading your palm, like this is the palm of your hand, and someone's going to like read it. He took my hand and stared at it for the longest time. His own hand was soft and warm. Mine was sweating like crazy. He was saying, and tracing the lines of my palm with his finger. It gave me the shivers, but not in an entirely unpleasant way. The sun was beating down on us, and I thought it might be nice to stay there forever, with him just running his finger along my palm like that. I thought about the newly born horse who knows nothing and feels everything. I thought about the smooth, beautifully folded world. Finally, Ben said, "Do you want the good news first or the bad news?" "The bad news." "It isn't real bad, is it?" He coughed. "The bad news is I can't really read palms." I snatched my hand away. "Don't you want to know the good news?" he asked. I started walking. "The good news is that you let me hold your hand for almost 5 minutes, and you didn't flinch once." I didn't know what to make of him. He walked me all the way home, even though I refused to speak to him. He waited on the porch until I was ready to go to Phoebe's, and then he walked me to her house. When I knocked on Phoebe's door, Ben said, "I'll be going now." I took a quick look at him and turned back to the door. But in the instant that I was turning away, he leaned forward, and I do believe his lips kissed my ear. I'm not sure this is what he intended. I was sure it happened. In fact, I was not sure it happened at all, because before I knew it, he had hopped down the steps and was walking away. The door inched open, and there was Phoebe's round face, as white and frightened as you'd ever could imagine. "Quick," she said, "come in." She led me into the kitchen. On the table was an apple pie, and beside were 3 envelopes. One was for Phoebe, one for Prudence, and one for their father. I opened my note, Phoebe said, showing it to me. It said, "Keep all the door locked and call your father if you need anything. I love you, Phoebe." It was signed Mom. Hold on, I have to adjust my computer. Start the slide. I didn't think too much of it, Phoebe, I said. I know. It doesn't sound terrible or anything. In fact, my first thought was, well, good. She knows I'm old enough to be here by myself. I figured she was out shopping, or maybe she even decided to return to work, even though she wasn't supposed to go to Rocky Rubbers until next week. But then Prudence came home and opened her note. Phoebe showed me the note left for Prudence. It said, "Please heat up the spaghetti sauce and boil the spaghetti. I love you, Prudence." It was signed Mom. I still didn't think too much of it, but Phoebe was suspicious. Prudence made the spaghetti while I helped Phoebe set the table. Phoebe and I even made a salad. "I do feel sort of independent," Phoebe said. When Phoebe's father came home, Phoebe showed him his note. He opened it and sat down, staring at the piece of paper. Phoebe looked over his shoulder and read the note aloud. "I had to go away. I can't explain. I'll call you in a few days." I had a sinking feeling. We're going to take pause there. Why is Sal having this sinking feeling? Dun dun. Because her mom left. Her mom left. She had to get away, and she wasn't able to return. So all of a sudden, Phoebe's mom said, had to get away. Couldn't explain, but she'll call in a few days. Few days, that's like, how? Few days, like 3 days, 5 days, 2 days? Who knows? Prudence started making a million questions. What does she mean? Go away where? Why can't she explain? Why didn't she tell you? Did she mention this? A few days? Where did she go? Maybe we should call the police, Phoebe said. I think she was kidnapped or something. "Oh, Phoebe," Mr. Winterbottom said. "I'm serious," she said. "Maybe the lunatic came into the house and dragged her off." "Phoebe, that is not funny." "I'm not being funny. I mean it. It could happen." Prudence was still asking her questions. Where did she go? Why didn't she mention this? Didn't she tell you? Where did she go? "Prudence, I honestly cannot say," her father said. "I think we should call the police," Phoebe repeated. "Phoebe, if she was kidnapped, would the lunatic, as you say, allow her to sit down and write these notes?" He stood up, removed his coat, and said, "Let's eat." As I left, Phoebe said, "My mother has disappeared. Sal, don't tell anyone. Don't tell a soul." At home, my father was slumped over the photo album. He used to close the album quickly when I came into the room, as if he was embarrassed to be caught with it. Lately, however, he didn't bother to close it. It was as if he didn't have the strength to do that. On the open page was a photo of my father and mother sitting in the grass beneath the sugar maple, his arms around her, and she was sort of folded into him. His face was pressed up next to hers, and their hair blended together. They looked like they were connected. "Phoebe's mother went away," I said. He looked up at me. "She left some notes, and she said she's coming back, but I don't believe it." I went upstairs and tried to work on my mythology report. My father came into the doorway and said, "People usually come back." Now I can see that he was just talking in general, just trying to be comforting. But then that night, what I heard in what he said was the tiniest reinsurance of something I had been thinking and hoping. I had been praying that a miracle would happen and my mother would come back and we would return to buy banks and everything would be exactly as it used to be. That is the end of chapter 20. So we keep on hearing how Sal says her mother's not coming back. So we don't know why she can't come back, but her father said people usually come back. So we'll see what's going to happen to Mrs. Winterbottom. Blindside plot twist, she is MIA. 21 is called Souls, and it's quite a short chapter. At school the next day, Phoebe wore a fixed expression, a sealed, thin smile. That's like, you know, not really talking, just like, "Oh, yep, everything's fine." Tiny smile. It must have been hard for her to maintain that smile because by the time English class came around, her chin was quivering from the strain. She was extremely quiet all day. She didn't speak to anyone but me, and the only thing she said to me was, "Stay at my house tomorrow night." It wasn't a question, it was a command. Mr. Berkway gave us 15-second exercise. As fast as we could without thinking, we were to draw something. He would tell us what we were to draw when everyone was ready. "Remember," he said, "don't think, just draw. 15 seconds, ready? Draw your soul. Go." We all wasted 5 seconds staring blankly back at him. When we saw that he was serious and was watching the clock, our pencils hit the paper. I wasn't thinking. There wasn't time to think. When Mr. Berkway called stop, everyone looked up dazed. Then we looked down at our papers and a buzz went around the room. We were surprised at what had come out of our pencils. At first, I noticed was that every single person had drawn a central shape. A heart, a circle, square, a triangle. I thought that was unusual. I mean, no one drew a bus or a spaceship or a cow. They all drew these same shapes. Next, I noticed that inside each figure was a distinct design. At first, it seemed that everyone's was different. There was a cross, a dark scribble, an eye, a mouth, a window. There was one that with a teardrop inside that I thought must have been Phoebe's. Then Mary Lou said, "Look at those two. They are exactly the same." Geez, and wow, and whose are those? The duplicate designs were a circle with a large maple leaf in the center, and the tips of the leaf touching the sides of the circle. One of the maple leaf circles were mine, and the others was Ben's. I liked that part because, oh snap, her and Ben drew the exact same thing for their soul. And obviously, they didn't talk about it. Just all of a sudden, they have the same picture for their soul. So maybe their thinking is kind of similar in some ways. 22 is going to be the last chapter for week 2 for this video. And then the rest is for week 3. But 22 on page 131 of my book is called Evidence. Dun 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 dun. I spent the next night at Phoebe's house, but I could hardly sleep. Phoebe kept saying, "Hear that noise?" And she would jump up to peer out the window in case it was a lunatic returning for the rest of us. Once she saw Mrs. Cadaver in her garage with a flashlight. I must have fallen asleep after that because I awoke to the sound of Phoebe crying in her sleep. When I woke her, she denied it. "I was not crying. I most certainly was not." In the morning, Phoebe refused to get up. Her father rushed into the room with 2 ties slung around his neck and his shoes in the hand. "Phoebe, you're late." I'm sick, she said. I have a fever and a stomach ache. Her father placed his hand on her forehead, looked deep into her eyes, and said, I'm afraid you have to go to school. I'm sick, honest, she said. It might be cancer. Phoebe, I know you're worried, but there's nothing we can do but wait. We have to go on with things. We can't Malinger. We can't Malinger. We can't what? Phoebe said. Malinger. Here, look it up. He tossed her a dictionary from her desk and tore down the hall. My mother is missing, and my father hands me a dictionary, Phoebe said. She looked up Malinger and read the definition: to pretend to be ill in order to escape duty or work. She slammed the book shut. I am not Malingerine. Prudence was in a frenzy. Where is my white blouse? Phoebe, have you seen it? I could have sworn. She pulls things out of her closet and flung them on the bed. Phoebe reluctantly got dressed, pulling a wrinkled blouse and skirt from the closet. Downstairs, the kitchen table was bare. No bowls of muesli, Phoebe said. No glasses of orange juice or whole wheat toast. Whole wheat toast. She touched the white sweater hanging on the back of the chair. My mother's favorite white cardigan, she said. She snatched the sweater and waved it in front of her father. Look at this. Would she leave this behind? Would she? He reached forward and touched its sleeve, and rubbing the fabric between the fingers for a moment. Phoebe, it's an old sweater. Phoebe put it on over her wrinkled blouse. I was uneasy because everything that happened at Phoebe's that morning reminded me of when my mother left. For weeks, my father and I fumbled around like ducks in a fit. Nothing was where it was supposed to be. The house took on a life of its own, hatching piles of dishes and laundry and newspapers and dust. My father must have said, I'll be jigglerd 3,000 times. The chickens were fidgety, the cows were skittish, and the pigs were solemn and glum. Our dog, Moody Blue, whimpered for hours on end. My father said that my mother was not coming back. I refused to believe it. I brought all her postcards down from my room and said, she wrote me all these. She must be coming back. And just like Phoebe, who had waved her mother's sweater in front of her father, I had brought a chicken in from the coop. Would Mom leave her favorite chicken? I demanded. She loves this chicken. What I really meant was, how can she not come back to me? She loves me. At school, Phoebe slammed her books on her desk. Beth Ann said, Hey, Phoebe, your blouse is a little wrinkled. My mom's away, Phoebe said. I iron my own clothes now, Beth Ann said. I even iron to me, Phoebe whispered. I think I'm having a genuine heart attack. I thought about a baby rabbit that our dog Moody Blue caught and carried around. She was not actually luncheon on the rabbit, just playing. I finally coaxed Moody Blue to drop it, and when I picked up the rabbit, its heart was beating faster than anything. Faster and faster it went. Then all of a sudden, its heart stopped. I took the rabbit to my mother, and she said, It's dead, Sally Monica. It can't be dead. It was just alive a minute ago. Timeout. Mrs. Jones texted me. Timeout, sorry. Sorry. That was my 5-second break. Mrs. Jones asked me a question. I wondered what would happen if all of a sudden Phoebe's heart beat itself out like the rabbit's and had fell down and died right there at school. Her mother would not even know Phoebe was dead. After homeroom, Mary Lou and Phoebe, did I hear you say your mother is away? Christy and Megan gathered around. Is your mother on a business trip? Christy said. My mother's always going to Paris on business trips. So where is your mother? On a business trip? Phoebe nodded. Where did she go? Megan asked. Tokyo? Saudi Arabia? Phoebe said. London. Oh, London, Christy said. My mother's been there. Phoebe turned to me with a puzzled expression on her face. I think she was surprised at what she had said, but I knew exactly why she had lied. It was easier sometimes. I had done this myself when people asked about my mother. Don't worry, Phoebe, I said. She snapped. I'm not worried. I had done that too. Whenever anyone tried to console me about my mother, I had nearly chopped their heads off. I was a complete ornery old donkey. My father would say, You must feel terrible. I denied it. I don't, I told him. I don't feel anything at all. But I did feel terrible. I didn't want to wake up in the morning, and I was afraid to go to sleep at night. By lunchtime, people were coming at Phoebe from all directions. How long will your mother be in London? Mary Lou asked. Is she having tea with the Queen? Tell her to go to Convent Gardens, Christy said. My mother loves Convent Garden. It's Covent Garden, Cabbage Head, Mary Lou said. It isn't, Christy said. I'm sure it's Covent Garden. After school, we walked home with Ben and Mary Lou. Phoebe wouldn't say a word. What's the matter, Phoebe? Ben said. Talk. Out of the blue, I said, Everyone has his own agenda. Ben tripped over the curb, and Mary Lou gave me a peculiar look. I kept hoping that Phoebe's mother would be home. Even though the door was locked, I kept hoping. Are you sure you want to come in with me? I said. Maybe you want to be alone. Phoebe said, I don't want to be alone. Call your dad and see if you can stay for dinner again. Inside, Phoebe called, Mom. She walked through the house, looking in each room. That's it, Phoebe said. I'm going to search for clues, for evidence that the lunatic has been here and dragged my mother off. I wanted to tell her that she was just fishing in the air and that probably her mother had not been kidnapped, but I knew that Phoebe didn't want to hear it. When my mother did not return, I imagined all sorts of things. Maybe she had cancer and didn't want to tell us and was hiding in Idaho. Maybe she got knocked on the head and had amnesia and was wandering around Lewiston, not knowing who she really was or thinking she was someone else. My father said, She does not have cancer, Sal. She does not have amnesia. Those are fishes in the air. But I didn't believe him. Maybe he was trying to protect her. Or me. Phoebe prowled through the house, examining the walls, carpet, searching for bloodstains. She found several suspicious spots and unidentifiable hair strands. Phoebe marked the spots with pieces of adhesive tape and collected the hairs in an envelope. Prudence was in a lather when she came home. I made it, she said. I made it. And she was jumping about. I made cheerleading. When Phoebe reminded her that their mother had been kidnapped, Prudence said, Oh, Phoebe, Mom wasn't kidnapped. She stopped jumping and looked around the kitchen. So, what are we supposed to have for dinner? Phoebe rummaged around in the cupboards. Prudence opened up the freezer compartment and said, Look at this. For a terrible moment, I thought she found chopped up body parts in there. Maybe, just maybe, Phoebe was right. Maybe the lunatic had done away with the mother. I couldn't look. I could hear Prudence moving things in the freezer. At least she wasn't screaming. There were no body parts in the freezer. Instead, stacked neatly with plastic containers, each with a note attached. Brock Len Cass, 350, 1 hour, Prudence read. Mac cheese, 325, 45 minutes, and on and on. What's Brock Len Cass? I said. Phoebe pried open the lid. Inside was green and yellow hardness mass, broccoli and lentil casserole, she said. When their father came home and was surprised to see the dinner on the table, Prudence showed him the freezer contents. He said. At dinner, we all ate quietly. I don't suppose you've heard anything from Mom, Prudence asked her father. Not yet, he said. I think we should call the police, Phoebe said. Phoebe, I'm serious. I found some suspicious spots. Phoebe pointed to the two adhesive tape areas beneath the dining table. What's tape doing down there? He asked. Phoebe explained about the potential blood spots. Blood, Prudence said. She stopped eating. Phoebe pulled out the envelope and emptied the hair strands on the table. Strange hairs, Phoebe explained. Prudence said, Ugh. Mr. Winterbottom tapped the fork against the knife. Then he stood up, took Phoebe's arms, and said, Follow me. He went to the refrigerator, opened the freezer compartment, and indicated the plastic containers. If your mother had been kidnapped by a lunatic, would she have time to prepare all these meals? Would she have been able to say, Excuse me, Mr. Lunatic, will I prepare 10 or 20 meals for my families to eat while I am kidnapped? You don't care, Phoebe said. Nobody cares. Everybody has his own idiot agenda. Remember where we heard that? That was like the first note from the crazy lunatic, or from the messenger that we don't know. I left shortly after dinner. Mr. Winterbottom was in his study, phoning his wife's friend to see if they had any idea where she might have gone. At least, Phoebe said to me, he's doing something, but I still think we should call the police. As I left, Phoebe's, a dead leaf crackle voice of Margaret Cadaver called me to her house next door. Sal, do you want to come in? Your father's here. We're having dessert. Join us. My father appealed behind her. Come on, Sal, he said. Don't be a goose. I'm not a goose, I said. I already had dessert, and I'm going home to work on my English report. My father turned to Margaret. I better go with. Sorry. Margaret didn't say anything. She just stood there as my father retrieved his jacket and joined me. I knew it was mean, but I felt as if I'd won a little victory over Margaret Cadaver. On the way home, when my father asked if Phoebe's mother had come back yet, I said no. Phoebe thinks a lunatic has carried her off. A lunatic? Isn't that a bit far-fetched? That's what I thought at first. But you never know, do you? I mean, it could happen. There could actually be a lunatic who. Sal, I was going to explain about the nervous young man and the mysterious messages, but my father would call me a goose. Instead, I said, how do you know that someone, not exactly a lunatic, but just someone, didn't make Mom go to Idaho? Idaho. Maybe it was blackmail. Sal, your mother went because she wanted to go. You should have stopped her. A person isn't a bird. You can't cage a person. She shouldn't have gone. If she hadn't gone, Sal, I'm sure she intended to come back. We had reached our house, but we didn't go in. We sat on the porch steps. Dad said, you can't predict. A person can't foresee. You never know. He looked away, and I felt miserable right along with him. I apologized for being ornery and for upsetting him. He put his arm around me, and we sat together on the porch, two people being completely pitiful and lost. That is the end of the reading for week 2. We have about 100 pages left for week 3. That chapter made me so sad. Sal is definitely, all this stuff with Phoebe's mom is really making Sal think of her mom. And being a goose means like silly. Like, don't be a silly goose. So they're telling her, don't be a goose. But I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope you guys feel free to watch this or, of course, read it yourself. Happy learning. I will hopefully talk to you guys soon.